Welcome, my friends. Before we begin, if you find stories like this meaningful tales of family sacrifice and the lessons life sometimes delivers in the harshest ways, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel. It helps us keep sharing these journeys with you, and you won't miss the ones still to come. Tonight's story is titled, I Cooked Christmas Dinner for My Son and He Never Showed Up. It was Christmas Eve, and my little house glowed the way it always did this time of year. I had strung the same multicolored lights across the porch, the same ones my late wife used to untangle every December, laughing at the way the bulbs never wanted to cooperate. Inside, the air was warm and thick, with the smell of roasted turkey honeyed ham and the sweet spices of cinnamon and nutmeg. I'd spent the whole day cooking. The kitchen counter was crowded with dishes: mashed potatoes whipped smooth with butter, green bean casserole topped with crisp onions, stuffing seasoned the way my mother once taught me. I'd even baked a pumpkin pie, though I was never very good at pie crusts. My wife had been the baker. Still, I tried. For him. For my son. I set the table for two. Just two. The table itself was old oak, scratched by decades of family meals, but I had laid out the good plates and the wine glasses we only ever used on holidays. At the far end, I placed a single tall candle, the kind that flickers just enough to make shadows dance against the wall. And in front of that candle, I placed the chair I had polished, the chair I had saved especially for him. My son David. He was 32 now, married with a baby boy of his own. My grandson. I had imagined that tonight, for once, it might feel like the old days. He and I sitting across from each other, eating too much, talking too little, but enough to remind ourselves that we were still family. The clock ticked past 6, then 7. At 8, the food began to cool. I reheated the turkey in the oven, fussed with the pie crust that had sagged a little, checked the driveway every time headlights passed by. But the driveway remained empty. The house remained quiet. At 9, the phone rang. My heart leapt finally. I snatched it up. It was his voice, tired and hurried. Dad, listen. I'm sorry. We're at Jenna's parents' house. They've got a big dinner. A lot of people came. It's just easier if we stay here. I stood there, phone in one hand, carving knife still in the other. My voice came out small, almost pleading. But son, I cooked. I made everything you like. Can't you at least stop by, even for dessert? A pause, the sound of voices and laughter in the background on his end. Then, Dad, I can't. Maybe next year, all right, gotta go. Merry Christmas. The line went dead. I stayed standing in the kitchen, staring at the candlelit chair across the table. The house was so quiet I could hear the faint buzz of the refrigerator. Outside, snow was falling in slow, steady sheets, blanketing the street in white. Inside, all I could feel was the weight of that empty chair. And in that silence, a single truth struck me harder than any winter wind. Could he never came. The food on the table, the candle flickering, the years of sacrifice and love that had led to this night, it all stood untouched, waiting for a son who never walked through the door. The candle on the table flickered lower, and in its glow, I couldn't help but drift back to the years when Christmas was never quiet, when the walls of this house were alive with laughter and the chaos of family. I remembered one year in particular. David must have been 8 or 9. The snow had piled so high outside that our old Chevy pickup barely made it up the driveway. My wife Linda had flour dusted across her cheeks from rolling cookie dough, and the smell of gingerbread filled every room. David had been running through the house in his socks, sliding across the wood floor, pretending he was a hockey player. His cheeks were red, his eyes bright, and when he crashed into the couch, he laughed so hard he nearly cried. Back then, Christmas meant all 3 of us together. It wasn't about the size of the turkey or the price of the gifts. It was about the rituals. David hanging his lopsided ornaments on the tree, Linda humming along to Bing Crosby as she basted the ham, me sneaking sips of eggnog and pretending I didn't. We were a family, and that was enough. I could still picture the way David used to crawl onto my lap when the presents were all unwrapped and say, "Thanks, Dad." Best Christmas ever. His hair smelled like pine needles and cinnamon from being too close to the tree. I would hold him tight, whisper, You're welcome, son, and think to myself that no matter how hard life was, moments like these made it worth it. It's funny the little details memory chooses to keep. The chipped red mug Linda always used for hot cocoa. The way the Christmas lights reflected off the frost on the windows. The creak of the floorboards as David tried to sneak into the living room at night to see if Santa had come. I see them clearer now than I see the cold table sitting in front of me tonight. And I remembered the promise I made to myself the Christmas after Linda died. David was only 17. I was standing by the tree staring at her empty chair, and I swore I'll make sure he never spends a holiday alone. I'll give him the kind of Christmases his mother would want. That vow became my compass. Every December since I poured myself into keeping the tradition alive, stringing lights, cooking feasts, keeping the chair warm even if I was the only one left to care. But traditions are fragile things. They depend on everyone playing their part. And when one person steps away, the whole picture tilts. As the memories replayed in my head, I got up from the table and walked into the living room. The tree stood tall in the corner, its branches sagging slightly under the weight of decades of ornaments. Some were shiny store-bought ones, but most were homemade David's paper snowflakes, painted popsicle stick stars, a cracked ceramic angel Linda had made back when we had nothing but hope and each other. I touched one of David's old ornaments, a cardboard cutout of his handprint from kindergarten. The edges were frayed, the marker had faded, but I could still see the outline of those tiny fingers. I thought about how those same hands now held his own son, my grandson. And yet tonight those hands couldn't even turn a doorknob and walk into his father's house. The clock chimed 10. Outside, the world was still. Inside, the only sound was the faint hum of the heater. The feast on the table grew colder with each passing minute, just like the distance between me and the boy I once promised the world to. I stood there surrounded by the ghosts of Christmases past and felt the weight of every broken promise, not mine, but his. The phone call didn't just end, it stayed. It lingered in the corners of the house like smoke you can't clear. His voice, my son's voice, still echoed in my ears. Dad, it's easier if we just stay here with Jenna's family. Easier. That was the word that cut the deepest. As if I were an obstacle to be worked around like traffic on the freeway or a bill that could wait until next month. I wasn't his father anymore. I was an inconvenience. I stared at the phone lying on the counter, its screen already black like the conversation had never even happened. The carving knife still rested beside it, glinting in the dim light. The turkey sat carved and cooling on the platter, each slice neatly arranged as if waiting for approval. I'd taken my time with it, remembering how David always liked the dark meat, how he used to sneak pieces before dinner when he thought I wasn't looking. I set a plate at his place anyway, just as I had every year. Habit is stubborn like that. But the chair remained empty. The candle across from me, flickering like it too, was tired of waiting. The house had never felt larger or quieter. The walls seemed to expand with every second of silence, until even my own breathing sounded foreign. I could hear the radiator ticking in the corner, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the snowplow groaning down the street. Ordinary sounds, but cruel tonight because they were the only company I had. I poured myself a glass of wine from the good bottle, the one I'd saved for this dinner. It tasted flat on my tongue, bitter in my throat. I raised the glass toward the empty chair as if toasting to someone who wasn't there. The gesture felt pathetic. The swallow burned on the way down. Then came the buzz. The phone again. My heart jumped before I even saw the screen. Maybe he changed his mind. Maybe he's coming. A text. 4 words, Merry Christmas, Dad. Sorry. Sorry. That word was worse than silence. Sorry is what you say when you bump into a stranger on the sidewalk, not when you abandon the man who raised you at a table set for 2. My thumb hovered over the keyboard. I started typing. I cooked your favorites. The house is warm. It would mean the world if you came. Then I erased it. Typed again, I understand. Maybe next year. Erased that too. Finally, I sent only Merry Christmas, son. It felt like lying. I wandered into the living room, the scarf I'd wrapped for him, still sitting on the coffee table. Navy wool with a thin gray stripe. I'd bought it because it looked like something he could wear to work, something practical. something to remind him of me on cold mornings. I rested my hand on the package, the tape not even sticking right, because my fingers had trembled when I wrapped it. It wasn't just a gift. It was hope folded into fabric covered in paper. The Christmas tree blinked in the corner, its colored lights reflecting off the frosted window. One ornament caught my eye, a cardboard handprint David had made in kindergarten. His tiny fingers outlined in green marker the words "To Dad, Love." David scrawled in his old teacher's handwriting. I traced it with my thumb. My chest tightened. I sat down in Linda's old chair. The leather creaked the way it always had when she leaned back with her cup of cocoa. Her absence was a presence all its own, a weight pressing down on me in the quiet. I wish she were here, if only so I wouldn't feel so foolish for setting the table for two when I should have known better. The clock struck 10. Outside the snow fell thicker, muting the world beyond my window. Inside the silence screamed. I could still hear David's voice, distant, distracted already somewhere else. It's easier if we stay here. Easier for him, maybe. But for me, nothing had ever felt harder. At some point, I couldn't take the silence anymore. It pressed on me heavy, suffocating. The walls seemed to lean in the ceiling lower, every corner too dark. I pushed back from the table, the chair legs scraping across the floor like a shout in the stillness. I grabbed my coat from the hook by the door. It was old, frayed at the cuff zipper sticking halfway, but it was warm and it smelled faintly of cedar from the closet. I pulled it on, shoved my hands into the pockets, and stepped outside. The night air hit me sharp, cold enough to sting my nose. Snowflakes clung to my eyebrows, melted against the heat of my skin. The whole street lay under a thick blanket of white quiet, except for the occasional crunch of a neighbor's boots or the faint hum of an engine far off. I stood on the porch, looking out over the row of houses across the street. Through the windows, I could see families gathered around tables, kids darting between rooms with that sugar-high energy Christmas always brings. Warm lights poured out onto the snow, golden rectangles in the dark. Laughter carried faintly through the air, muffled by distance, but still sharp enough to reach me. It should have been comforting. Instead, it felt like a reminder. A cruel comparison. Out there, every house had someone. In here, I had no one. I walked down the steps, boots crunching into the untouched powder on the sidewalk. The air was still so still that every exhale rose in a slow, ghostly plume before dissolving. I shoved my hands deeper into my pockets, tried to bury the ache in my chest with the cold. I thought about years past, how I used to carry David on my shoulders through these same streets when the snow was high, how Linda would laugh and tell us we looked like a circus act. David's mittened hands would clutch my head and he'd squeal every time I pretended to stumble. Those echoes seemed louder tonight than the present. I reached the corner of the block where the street lamp buzzed, faintly casting a yellow pool onto the snow. I stopped there, staring at the frost glittering under the light. It looked almost magical, like a stage set, and I wondered for the first time if my life had become just that, a stage where everyone else had walked off, leaving me standing under the lights alone. I pulled my phone from my pocket, stared at the black screen. No new messages. No calls. Not even a thank you for the scarf waiting under the tree. My thumb hovered over his name in my contacts. I could call him again, beg him just to hear his voice, but pride or maybe survival kept me from pressing down. Instead, I slid the phone back into my pocket and turned toward home. Each step back felt heavier, as though the snow itself was trying to hold me down. When I reached the porch again, I paused, looked back one more time at the houses glowing with light and laughter. I imagined David inside one of them, smiling, eating, holding his son. I imagined the toast he might be making with his in-laws, the way Jenna's family would clap him on the back like he belonged there more than he ever belonged with me. And then I imagined the chair at my table, still empty. Still waiting. The anger came quietly, like a tide that sneaks up in the dark. My breath quickened, not from the cold, but from something breaking loose inside. For years, I had told myself patience was love, that sacrifices, no matter how heavy, were worth it because one day they would be repaid in something greater. Gratitude, togetherness, respect. But standing there on my own porch, staring into the night, I realized patience had only built me a prison. And tonight was the night I finally felt the bars. I went back inside, shut the door behind me, and leaned against it. The house smelled of food cooling in the kitchen. The tree still blinked stubbornly cheerful. I stared at the empty table, at the chair that might as well have been a monument to my own foolishness. And then very quietly I said it out loud to the room he never came. The words hung there, heavier than silence, truer than hope. Back inside, the cold still clung to me. My cheeks burned as the heat from the furnace brushed against skin that hadn't thawed yet. I hung my coat on the same hook by the door, and stood there staring at the kitchen table as though it might explain itself. The candle was out, the food untouched, the plate in front of the empty chair, still gleaming, waiting for someone who would never sit there. My eyes drifted to the sideboard again. That drawer. I'd opened it earlier, just a touch, but tonight something inside me pressed harder. I walked to it, pulled the handle, until the wood gave with a reluctant groan, and there it was, my history of sacrifice, bound in rubber bands and paper clips. The stack wasn't neat. Receipts poked out like accusing fingers, statements folded and refolded until the creases had worn thin. Bank transfers. Loan agreements. Checks never cashed by me, always by him. I spread them across the table like evidence at a trial. A hospital bill from when David was 22 and had broken his leg playing basketball at the rest center. Insurance covered some, but not all. I'd sold Linda's old jewelry, the one she wanted passed down to a daughter. We never had to cover the rest. A tuition payment stub from his third year of college. He'd lost his scholarship, too many nights spent working shifts to keep up with grades. I picked up a second job at the garage, worked weekends for almost a year so he could stay enrolled. I remembered the way his voice cracked when he told me, "Dad, I couldn't have done it without you." And I'd believed him. Mortgage records. Not mine, his. I had refinanced my own house twice, siphoning off equity I'd built with sweat and years, just so he and Jenna could buy that suburban place they wanted. "We'll pay you back, Dad." He'd set his arm around her, her eyes darting past mine. But they never did. I stared at the numbers. Tens of thousands. Then hundreds. The total blurred in my vision, my eyes hot, not with tears this time, but with something sharper. All of it laid out on the table where his plate still sat. Sacrifice staring back at me side by side with rejection. I pressed my palms flat on the papers, leaned forward, until my shoulders curved over them. My breath fogged the surface. For a moment I thought about crumpling them all, throwing them into the fire, and watching the years turn to ash. But another thought struck harder. No one knew. Not his friends. Not Jenna's family. Not even David himself in the way he should. They only saw him as the man who built his life by his own hands, who made it. They never saw the hands behind his. I clenched one paper tighter, the loan agreement from 5 years ago. My name signed in black ink. At the bottom, promising away more than money. Promising away pieces of myself. I sat back in the chair and exhaled through my teeth. The air came out shaky, but the resolve underneath it was not. If I was invisible to my own son, maybe it was time others saw me. Saw the truth. Saw him. I gathered the papers into a pile, stacked them carefully, and slid them into a manila envelope. My hands stopped trembling as soon as I did. For years, I had been the silent benefactor, the man who absorbed the blows in the dark. Tonight, for the first time, I thought about stepping into the light. The clock chimed 11. Outside, the snow kept falling, the street empty. Inside, the table was no longer just a place for food. It had become a battlefield, and the evidence was on my side. I didn't clear the table. Not this time. The food sat there, cooling the empty plate, an untouched wine glass waiting like props from a play that had closed before the final act. Instead, I carried the envelope of papers into the living room and set it on the coffee table beside the wrapped scarf. The two objects couldn't have been more different. One a symbol of quiet love, the other of years of sacrifice that nobody wanted to acknowledge. I lowered myself into Linda's old chair, the leather creaking beneath me. For a long while, I simply sat there staring at the Christmas tree. The lights blinked in their familiar rhythm. Red, green, gold, but tonight they looked less like cheer and more like signals I couldn't read. My mind wouldn't quiet. Every time I closed my eyes, the call replayed. His distracted tone. The laughter of voices in the background that weren't mine. It's easier if we stay here. As if his life had outgrown me like an old coat shoved to the back of the closet. I thought of Linda again, how she would have handled this. She'd been softer than me, gentler. She would have told me to be patient, to keep the door open, to remember that people make mistakes. But I wasn't sure anymore. Patience had gotten me here sitting alone on Christmas Eve with proof of my life's work stuffed into an envelope no one cared to see. The anger rose in me like a slow flame. Not a wildfire, not yet, but steady control, warming me even as the house felt colder. I pressed my hand against the envelope, felt the thickness of it, the weight. These weren't just papers. They were my story. My sweat, my time, my sacrifices, all reduced to numbers that my son never bothered to count. I whispered into the room, the words surprising me with how steady they sounded. It's time someone else knows. The clock in the hall ticked louder as though it approved. I leaned forward, elbows on my knees, hands clasped tight. My breathing was heavier now, not quite calm, not quite frantic. Somewhere between grief and determination. The line where patience finally crosses into resolve. I thought about Jenna's parents, the ones David spent the night with. Their house would be full of people, food, laughter. I could picture him there, head bent close to his wife, her father pouring him another glass of wine, their voices raised in holiday cheer. Did they even know? Did anyone at that table know who had paid for the very roof over his head? Or did they think David had done it all on his own? A self-made man married into comfort, the idea made my jaw tighten. My teeth ground against each other. I imagined walking into that room, setting the envelope down in front of them, watching the smiles fall from their faces as they saw the truth. For the first time all evening I smiled. Not a happy smile, something sharper, colder. I stood restless now, pacing the room. My footsteps thudded against the old wood floors, echoing in the quiet house. I picked up one of the ornaments from the tree, David's handprint, the faded cardboard one. I held it up to the light. His fingers had been so small then. I thought about how those same hands now wrote checks with money I had provided, built a life on foundations I had poured. But he'd never admit it. That I realized was the true betrayal. Not just that he hadn't shown up tonight, but that he had erased me from the story of his own life. I set the ornament back on the tree and sat again. I pulled the scarf from the coffee table, tore the wrapping paper away, and held it in my hands. The fabric was soft, heavy with warmth. I had bought it with the hope of connection. Now it felt like a reminder of futility. I folded it carefully, slid it into the envelope alongside the papers, and closed it. A gift and a reckoning bound together. The night stretched on. Midnight came and went. The house was still. My anger was not. By the time I finally stood and turned off the tree, I knew one thing for certain. This wouldn't end with me sitting quietly in an empty house again. When morning came, it didn't arrive gently. The light knifed in through the blinds, sharp and uninvited. I squinted against it, sitting in the chair where I must dozed off, the envelope still resting on the coffee table. My neck ached, my back protested, and the house was as quiet as it had been the night before. Christmas morning. For years, that phrase had meant chaos, wrapping paper, torn apart coffee, percolating in the kitchen, Linda's voice humming along to carols on the radio, David squealing when he got the toy he had been hinting at for months. I used to love that chaos. It meant family, it meant warmth. Now, Christmas morning was just another day in an old man's house, one where the only sound was the creak of the furnace trying to keep up with the cold. I stood stretched and shuffled into the kitchen. The food from last night still sat in the fridge. I hadn't touched it. I poured myself a cup of coffee, black and bitter, and sat at the table. The empty chair across from me was still there, its silence louder than anything. I pulled the envelope closer, ran my thumb along its edge. I thought about everything inside it, every sacrifice I'd made, every dollar I'd given, every piece of myself I'd traded away for his future. And I thought about how in return I'd been given an empty chair and a text message. I tapped the envelope against the table, the sound dull and rhythmic like a drumbeat. An idea began to form, not a desperate one, but something sharper. If David wouldn't acknowledge me in private, then maybe he would have to face me in public. I pictured it. Jenna's family, all polished and smiling, sitting around their perfect dining table. The in-laws clinking glasses, praising David for the life he'd built. And me walking in with this envelope, sliding the papers across the table, watching their eyes widen as the truth unraveled in black and white. The image steadied me. It didn't make me feel good, not yet, but it gave me something I hadn't had in a long time: purpose. The phone on the counter buzzed again. A text from David. "Hope you're doing okay, Dad? We'll call later." I stared at it, the words flat and weightless. He didn't mean them. He had no idea what okay meant to me anymore. I didn't reply. Instead, I set the phone down, grabbed a pen, and pulled a legal pad from the drawer. I started writing dates, amounts, sacrifices. Not for myself. For the world. I wanted every person who thought my son was a self-made man to see exactly who had built his foundation. By the time the coffee had cooled, I had 3 pages filled. Tuition payments, mortgage assistance, hospital bills, utility bailouts. Each one a brick in the house of lies David had built. I leaned back, exhaling slowly. My hand ached. My heart pounded, but my mind was clearer than it had been in years. I wasn't going to beg anymore. I wasn't going to sit alone waiting for scraps of affection. If David wanted to erase me from his story, I'd make sure everyone else knew the real one. I gathered the papers, slid them back into the envelope, and held it against my chest for a moment. Then I whispered into the quiet house, "This year, the truth gets a seat at the table." The words didn't echo, but they didn't need to, because I believed them. By mid-morning, the snow outside had slowed. The streets were white, but not silent anymore. Children were out with sleds, their shrieks of joy carrying through the cold air. Neighbors waved to one another as they carried gifts to cars, arms full of brightly wrapped boxes. The world seemed to hum with togetherness, and from my window I felt like a man locked outside a house I had built myself. I turned back to the table, to the envelope. Last night, it had felt like a burden. This morning, it felt like ammunition. I made myself another cup of coffee and sat down with the legal pad again. This time, I didn't just list the sacrifices. I started to think about how they could be seen. Who needed to see them? Not David, not first. He'd just dismissed me as bitter. No. The people who mattered were the ones who looked at him with pride, the ones who thought he'd climbed the mountain all by himself. Jenna's family. Her parents especially. I remembered their smug smiles at the wedding, the way her father had shaken my hand like he was doing me a favor. The way her mother had whispered to a guest that David had finally elevated himself by marrying into their family. They had never looked at me as a man who had built anything, only as a relic, a tired mechanic who should be grateful his son had married above his station. They were the audience. I set down my pen and leaned back, picturing it. Their holiday table, everyone seated, laughter thick in the air. And me walking in with the envelope, laying the truth in front of them. Watching their faces collapse as the story unraveled. That would be justice. Not yelling, not begging, just facts stripped bare in front of the people who had erased me. But timing mattered. If I showed up uninvited, I'd just be the angry father turned away at the door. No, I needed to wait to pick the right moment. The moment when turning me away would make them look small, when listening to me would make them face themselves. I glanced around my house at the sagging wallpaper and the stack of unpaid bills on the counter. A house that had borne the cost of another man's life. For years, I had paid in silence. Now silence was over. I picked up my phone, scrolled through my contacts. Rose's name caught my eye, Linda's sister. She had always been kind to me, always suspicious of how much David leaned on me financially. If there was anyone who would listen, anyone who carry my story into the ears of others, it was her. My thumb hovered over her number. Not yet, I thought. Not yet. But soon. Instead, I opened a new note on my phone and began drafting something else, a letter. Not to David. To the people who thought they knew him. A confession of sorts, written in plain words, with receipts attached. I imagined handing it out at a gathering, each page sinking into the hands of those smug faces until they couldn't look anywhere but at me. The thought steadied me. The anger that had been boiling in me since last night cooled into something sharper, like steel forged in fire. Outside, the neighbor kids built a snowman. They cheered when it stood straight, their mittens clapping together. I watched them, and for a moment my chest tightened with a pang of memory. David at that age, his cheeks red, his laughter bright. But memory alone wasn't enough anymore. I turned back to the envelope, slid the scarf out, and set it aside. The papers alone were enough. Proof. Irrefutable. I said it again, this time louder, so the empty house had no choice but to listen. They're going to see the truth. And for the first time since the phone call, I felt almost steady. By the afternoon, the house felt unbearable. The blinking tree lights mocked me. The cold turkey in the fridge whispered of failure. I couldn't sit with it anymore. So I pulled on my boots, slipped the envelope under my arm, and drove across town to Rosa's house. Rosa was Linda's younger sister, the last real family I had left besides David. She lived in a modest little home on the south side, always smelling faintly of cinnamon and laundry soap. She'd raised 2 kids of her own, long since grown and gone, but she still called me on birthdays, still dropped off pies at Thanksgiving, even when David didn't bother showing up. Her porch light was on when I pulled into the driveway, even in the middle of the day. I knocked, and within seconds she opened the door, her eyes widening. "Max on Christmas," she said, her voice soft but tinged with surprise. I tried to smile, but it must have come out wrong because her expression shifted instantly to concern. "Come in. You look frozen." The warmth of her house hit me as I stepped inside. Cinnamon rolls cooling on the counter, a pot of coffee brewing, the faint sound of Bing Crosby on the radio. I lowered myself into one of her kitchen chairs, the envelope heavy in my hands. "What happened?" she asked, sitting across from me. I stared at the table for a long time before answering. "He didn't come, Rosa. David. Not last night, not this morning. Nothing but a text." Her mouth tightened. She reached across the table, covered my hand with hers. "I'm so sorry." I swallowed hard. My throat felt raw, like I'd been yelling even though I hadn't. I set the table. His favorite dishes. I even bought him a gift, but he never showed. Too busy with Jenna's family. Her eyes flicked toward the envelope I was clutching, and that I slid it across to her. She hesitated before opening it, her fingers careful, like she already sensed the weight inside. One by one, she pulled out the papers: tuition checks, mortgage records, receipts. Her eyes grew wider with each page. "Max," she whispered, her hand covering her mouth. "All of this you paid for, all of this for years," I said flatly. "College, hospital bills, their house, everything. And what do I have to show for it? An empty chair at Christmas." She set the papers down, exhaling sharply. "And Jenna's family doesn't know. They think David did it all himself," I said, bitterness creeping into my tone. "They pat him on the back, tell him what a provider he is. But every dollar came out of my pocket." Rosa shook her head slowly. "Max, this isn't just unfair. It's cruel." I leaned closer. "That's why I came here. I can't keep quiet anymore. Someone has to know. Someone besides me." Her eyes searched mine, testing, maybe afraid of what she saw. "And what are you going to do?" I tapped the stack of papers. "I'm going to show the truth. Publicly. No more hiding, no more silence. If David wants to erase me, then I'll carve my name into the story myself." For a long moment, Rosa didn't speak. Then she nodded slowly. "If that's what you're set on, then I'll stand with you. You shouldn't have to do this alone." The words hit me harder than I expected. For the first time in 2 days, I felt less like a ghost. I gathered the papers back into the envelope, slid it under my arm again. "Thank you, Rosa." She gave my hand one last squeeze. "Whatever you do, Max, make sure they can't look away." I stood, nodded once, and stepped back into the cold. The snow had stopped. The sky was gray heavy. But inside me, something else had cleared. This wasn't grief anymore. It was direction. The drive home from Rosa's was long and quiet, the kind of quiet that gives a man too much space in his own head. The wipers beat a steady rhythm against the windshield, clearing away the thin drizzle that had replaced the snow. My knuckles were white on the steering wheel. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I wasn't just thinking, I was plotting. I walked back into my house, hung up my coat, and dropped the envelope on the coffee table again. But this time, I didn't sit staring at it like a weight I couldn't lift. I sat across from it, like two players about to start a game. I opened the envelope, spread the papers out again, and began to group them. Tuition in one pile, mortgage and loan documents in another, hospital bills, utility payments. I wanted them organized, undeniable, like exhibits in a courtroom, because that's what this was, becoming a trial. And I was both the prosecutor and the witness. The question was, where would the trial take place? I leaned back, tapped my finger against the table. It had to be public. Quiet words in private could be brushed aside, twisted into bitterness. No, this had to be undeniable, unforgettable. I thought about the holidays coming up, the gatherings that Jenna's family loved to flaunt. They hosted dinners like royalty tables. Groaning with food, neighbors and friends gathered to admire their perfect lives. That's where David shone his arm around Jenna, laughter in his voice, the image of a man who had made it. That would be the stage. I could see it in my mind, the clink of glasses, the polished silverware, the smug smiles. And then me stepping into the light, sliding the envelope across the table, watching their faces as the lies unraveled. The thought made me sit up straighter. I pulled my legal pad closer and began to sketch it out like a mechanic planning a repair, gather every document. Copies, not originals. Choose the dinner, New Year's most likely. Everyone would be there. Walk in at the right moment, not desperate, not pleading. Calm. Controlled. Truth in hand. Leave them no escape. I paused, staring at the outline. It looked so simple written down. But the truth was, it wasn't simple at all. It was years of sacrifice compressed into pages, and one night that could never be undone. I stood and walked to the fireplace. The logs inside had burned low embers, glowing faintly. I imagined tossing the envelope and letting it all turn to ash. That would be the quiet way out, the way I'd always chosen. But my hand tightened on the edge of the mantel and I shook my head. Not this time. I thought again about Rose's words. Whatever you do, make sure they can't look away. I could already picture it. Jenna's father clearing his throat, ready to make a toast. Her mother smiling at the neighbors, proud of the family name. And then me standing there with the truth. Their laughter freezing their faces, dropping David shrinking in his seat as the mask fell away. For the first time in years, the image didn't make me feel small. It made me feel steady. I gathered the papers, slid them back into the envelope, and tucked it under my arm like a soldier cradling a weapon. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about every man who had been erased after giving everything. Every father who had built a life only to be told he was no longer needed. And if David thought he could bury me in silence, he was about to learn something new. The truth doesn't stay buried. That night, sleep didn't come. I tossed in bed for an hour before giving up, pulling on my robe and padding back to the living room. The envelope was still there waiting. I sat across from it like it was a companion I couldn't quite trust. I poured myself a drink, just one finger of whiskey, and held it in both hands, letting the burn warm me from the inside out. Then I opened the envelope again and spread the papers across the coffee table. Each page stared up at me, demanding to be read, demanding to be remembered. I began to talk out loud. At his wedding, I said, my voice rough with disuse. I paid for half the reception hall. Did you know that I looked at the papers as though they were an audience? When he lost his job, I covered their mortgage. I took out loans against my own house, and now I live in peeling paint while they live under a roof I bought. The words echoed against the walls, hollow but steady. I tried again, shifting tone. Not anger-controlled, deliberate. Ladies and gentlemen, I muttered, imagining Jenna's polished relatives staring at me. You look at my son and see a man who built his life by his own hands. But you've never seen mine. These hands, I held them up, scarred and calloused. They built the life you admire. And he erased me from it. I let the words hang in the silence. It wasn't perfect. My throat tightened, my voice cracked, but there was something powerful in hearing it out loud. It was like trying on armor, testing if it fit. I leaned back, exhaled. The whiskey glass trembled slightly in my hand. I stared at Linda's picture on the mantel. "Would you hate me for this?" I asked her. She looked back at me with that same quiet smile, frozen in time, her eyes softer than mine ever were. She had always been the patient one, the peacemaker. But even as I stared, I remembered her words from long ago when David was just a boy. "Don't ever let anyone make you small, Max. Not even your own family." I set the glass down, my chest heavy. That was it. That was the answer. This wasn't about vengeance for its own sake. This was about reclaiming the space I had given up piece by piece until there was nothing left of me at all. I stood, walked to the mirror by the door, and faced myself. The man staring back at me looked older than his years, but his eyes were sharper than they'd been in a long time. I practiced again, softer this time. I built this life. And if you want to pretend otherwise, then let's stop pretending. It sounded right. Not theatrical, not desperate. Honest. That's what would cut the deepest, not shouting, but truth spoken plainly. I gathered the papers back into the envelope and pressed it against my chest. I could almost hear the rustle of a crowded room, the hush that falls when truth is spoken. I imagined David's face in that moment, the shock, the denial, maybe even shame. A pang of sadness slipped in. He was still my son after all. But then I thought of the empty chair at my Christmas table, the unanswered silence of my house, the text message that cost him nothing. That sadness hardened into steel. Tomorrow, I told myself. Tomorrow I'd make the first outward step. Whether that meant talking to Rosa again or finding a way to slip into Jenna's world, I would move closer to the moment where they couldn't look away. I turned off the lamp, left the envelope on the table, and climbed the stairs to bed. For the first time in years, I felt like a man with a plan. The next morning, I woke before dawn. The house was still wrapped in silence, the kind that presses against your ears. I brewed coffee and sat by the window watching the neighborhood slowly come alive. Cars dusted with frost, neighbors carrying out bags of wrapping paper from yesterday's celebrations. Families moving together. I felt the envelope heavy under my arm. Not just paper anymore, strategy. I picked up the phone and scrolled to Rosa's name. My finger hovered for a moment before pressing call. She answered on the second ring, her voice warm but cautious. "Max? Yeah." "Sorry for calling early," I said. My voice came out rough, like I hadn't spoken all night. "You didn't sleep, did you?" she asked gently. "Not much. Listen, Rosa. You said yesterday you'd stand with me." "I did," she replied firm. "Well, I'm ready to take a step. But I need to do it smart. No yelling, no accusations in an empty room. They'll just call me bitter or worse. I need a stage where they can't look away." There was a pause. I could hear her clinking dishes in the background. Finally, she said, "Jenna's family. They're having that New Year's dinner, aren't they?" "Yes," I said, my jaw tightening. "They host every year. Neighbors, business friends, all of them. David will be there too. And you?" I hesitated. "I won't be invited. But I'll be there." Her voice dropped low and steady. "Then you'll need more than papers. You'll need someone in that room to listen. Someone who can't be dismissed." Her words sank into me. She was right. If I just barged in, they'd call me crazy. But if someone already inside vouched for me, handed me space, then the story couldn't be ignored. I rubbed my temples. Who would listen, though? They don't respect me. They never have. Maybe not. But I know someone who does, Rosa said. "Remember Henry Carlson, the old pastor from our church? He's been invited to their dinners a few times, charity connections, I think. He's always had a soft spot for you, Max. If he were there when you spoke, he wouldn't let them drown you out." The idea caught me off guard. Henry. The man who'd baptized David, who'd comforted me when Linda passed. His presence carried weight, not just with me, but in the community. I nodded slowly, even though she couldn't see me. That could work. "Then you should talk to him. Today. Tell him the truth. If anyone will understand, it's Henry." I thanked her and hung up the idea sparking like a match in my chest. I finished my coffee, grabbed my coat, and slid the envelope under my arm. For once, the cold outside didn't sting. It sharpened me. The drive to Henry's house was short. He lived in a modest brick home on the east side, the same place he'd been since I was a boy. When he opened the door, his eyes lit with recognition. "Max." "Well, this is a surprise," he said, his voice carrying the same warmth I remembered. I stepped inside the envelope, clutched tight. "Henry, I need to talk. About David. About the truth." He gestured me and led me to his study lined with books that smelled of old paper and cedar. I sat down, my throat dry. Slowly, I pulled the papers from the envelope and spread them across his desk. Henry leaned over his brow, furrowing as he read. Page after page, his expression shifted from surprise to sorrow, then to quiet anger. When he finally looked up, his eyes were steady. "Max, you've been carrying this alone all these years," I nodded. He pressed a hand to mine. "Then you're right. The truth needs to be told. And I'll be there when you tell it." Henry's study was quiet, the only sound the ticking of an old mantel clock. The kind of clock that made time feel heavier, each tick deliberate. He leaned back in his leather chair, the stack of papers spread before him, his fingers steepled under his chin. "This isn't just about debt, Max," he said, finally, his voice calm but firm. "It's about dignity. You've been erased from your own story. That has to end." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. I don't want yelling. I don't want fists pounding the table. I want them to choke on the truth, Henry. I want them to see it. His lips pressed into a thin line. "Then we make sure the stage is theirs, but the script is yours." I frowned. "What do you mean?" He leaned forward, tapping one of the documents. "Their New Year's dinner. They pride themselves on appearances, don't they? That's when they want everyone to see their family at its finest. That's when you show them what's real. Not in anger, but with calm, with evidence, with words that cannot be undone." I let the image fill my mind, a long, polished table, glasses, clinking laughter hanging in the air, and then silence as I laid down each page one by one, like cards in a hand no one could beat. Henry's gaze softened. "But you'll need support. When you walk into that room, they'll try to shout you down. My voice won't carry the same weight it once did, but I can stand there with you. And others, maybe Rosa. You won't be alone." The thought made my chest loosen slightly. For so long, I'd pictured myself against the world. The idea that others might stand beside me, it gave me strength I didn't know I still had. "Timing," Henry said, drawing me back. "That's everything. If you arrive too early, they'll bar the door. Too late, and they'll call it a stunt. No, you arrive when the glasses are full, when the room is settled, when no one can leave without shame." I nodded slowly. "And what do I say?" Henry smiled faintly, like a teacher guiding a student. "You say the truth. Not anger, not accusation. Truth delivered plainly cuts deeper than any rage. Show them the papers, yes. But make them feel what it cost you. Make them picture you sitting alone on Christmas while they feasted." The words struck me like a hammer. For the first time, I could see it clearly, not just me as a broken man, but me as a mirror they couldn't ignore. I rubbed my temples, exhaling slowly. "And David, what if he tries to deny it?" Henry leaned back. "Then let him. Each denial will fall apart under the weight of those papers. And when the room sees him squirm, when his silence grows louder than your words, they'll know where the truth lies." I sat back in my chair, my heart pounding, the clocks ticking, suddenly sharper in the silence. Henry folded the papers, neatly slid them back into the envelope, and placed it in my hands. His eyes met mine, steady and unwavering. "You've carried this alone long enough. On New Year's, you'll lay it down, not as a beggar asking for a place, but as a man reclaiming what was stolen." The envelope felt heavier than ever, but for once I didn't feel crushed by it. I felt ready. I stood, tucking it under my arm, and reached for Henry's hand. His grip was strong, reassuring. "Thank you," I said quietly. He gave a single nod. "Just remember, Mac's revenge is loud. But justice is unforgettable. As I walked out into the winter night, the stars sharp above me, I whispered to myself the only promise that mattered: they won't look away this time. The week leading up to New Year's crawled by like a slow-moving storm. Each day I woke with the same thought burning in my chest: soon. I cleared off the dining table in my house, old scratched oak that had borne decades of family meals, and turned it into a war desk. The envelope sat in the center like a king piece on a chessboard. Around it I spread folders, bank statements, copies of checks, even photos of David, as a boy reminders of what I had poured into him. The copier at the public library hummed for hours one afternoon as I made duplicates. Each paper, carefully aligned, pressed, spat out, stacked. I wanted 12 neat packets, enough for every guest who would sit at Jenna's table. Not one person would leave that night without holding the truth in their hands. When I laid the finished stacks out across my table, it almost looked ceremonial. Each pile marked years of my life sliced thin into documents. And together they told a story that couldn't be ignored. But papers alone wouldn't be enough. Henry had reminded me of that. It had to feel undeniable. So Rosa came over 2 nights before the dinner. She walked into my kitchen rolling up her sleeves like she had been drafted into battle. "All right, Max," she said, setting down her purse. "Let's practice." We sat at the table, the papers between us, and I began. I stumbled at first. My voice cracked, my hands shook. But Rosa didn't let me stop. She held my gaze, her eyes sharp but kind. "Again," she said. So I started over. This time steadier. Less anger, more conviction. I told her about the years of sacrifice, the nights I'd gone without so David could keep his lights on, the humiliation of Christmas dinners spent alone. "Better," she said softly when I finished. "But when you stand there in front of them, Max, you need to remember one thing: you're not asking for pity. You're showing them who you really are." I nodded, her words settling deep. The next day I drove past Jenna's parents' house. Their place stood like a monument on the hillside, windows gleaming, the long driveway lined with lanterns. Even in the cold daylight it screamed of money and image. I parked at the bottom of the hill and sat there for a long time, engine idling. I pictured the scene, the cars pulling up, the guests walking inside, laughter spilling from the windows, and me walking up that drive with the envelope under my arm, not knocking, not asking, entering. The thought made my pulse quicken. Fear, yes, but also something stronger: anticipation. When I got home, I laid out my suit. Navy blue, pressed, the one I'd worn to Linda's funeral. It still smelled faintly of cedar from the closet. I set it on the chair beside my bed. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in the dark living room, staring at the glowing tree lights. My hand rested on the envelope like it might float away if I let go. I whispered to the empty house, "This is the last time they get to erase me." The clock ticked toward midnight, and with each sound the weight inside me shifted. Not just grief now, not just anger. Something sharper, something unshakable. By the time dawn broke, I was ready. December 31st arrived with a sky the color of steel and air so sharp it felt like glass in my lungs. I spent most of the morning pacing the house, touching the envelope every time I passed it, as if I needed to confirm it was still there, still real. By afternoon, I had packed everything I needed into my old leather briefcase, 12 packets, each one clipped neatly, waiting like silent witnesses. I put on the navy blue suit. The fabric was stiff, but it fit, hugging me like armor. In the mirror, I barely recognized the man staring back, gray streaks in my hairlines carved deep around my mouth, but eyes bright with purpose. For years, I'd walked with shoulders slumped, always smaller in the rooms my son and his wife controlled. Not tonight. Tonight, I would take up space. At 6 o'clock sharp, I drove toward Jenna's parents' house. The neighborhood glowed with affluence, lanterns lining the drive's wreaths, heavy with gold ribbon, front lawns lit up like department store displays. My truck looked out of place among the parade of luxury sedans and glossy Civics parked along the street. I pulled in behind a black Mercedes, cut the engine, and sat for a moment with my hands gripping the steering wheel. Through the tall windows of the house, I could already see movement, guests mingling champagne glasses, clinking a chandelier, scattering light like diamonds across the room. My pulse quickened and I had to remind myself to breathe. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper notes I had scribbled in the quiet of my living room. Words to steady me if my voice faltered. I read them once, twice, then slipped them back inside. I grabbed the briefcase, stepped out into the cold, and started up the long driveway. The crunch of gravel under my shoes echoed too loudly, but no one inside noticed me yet. I passed by the glowing lanterns, each one flickering like they were guiding me forward. My breath puffed in front of me, white clouds rising into the night. At the door, I paused. Voices carried out through the walls, laughter silverware against porcelain, the kind of sound that once belonged to me. My hand hovered over the polished brass handle. For a heartbeat, I thought of turning back, of climbing into my truck and driving until the lights disappeared in the rear view. But then I pictured my empty table on Christmas, the chair meant for my son, the turkey carved but never eaten, the silence that had nearly swallowed me whole. I tightened my grip on the briefcase and opened the door. Warmth hit me immediately, along with a burst of sound music chatter, the clinking of glasses. The entryway gleamed marble floors, shining a staircase curling upward with garland wound around the banister. No one noticed me at first. I stepped inside, shutting the door softly behind me. And then someone looked up, a woman in a red sequin dress. Her laughter froze mid-sentence, her eyes flicking toward me, puzzled. A ripple went through the room as others followed her gaze. At the far end of the dining hall, David sat with Jenna at his side, her parents at the head of the table. His smile faltered when he saw me, and the glass in his hand paused halfway to his lips. "Dad," he said, his voice tight with disbelief. The room hushed. Dozens of eyes turned toward me. I walked forward slowly, each step deliberate, my shoes clicking against the marble like a drumbeat. I set the briefcase on the sideboard, the latch snapping open with a sharp metallic click. "Good evening," I said, my voice calm, steady. "I won't take much of your time. I just thought it was important that everyone here knows the truth." Gasps and whispers rippled through the guests. Jenna's mother straightened in her chair, her face tightening, while David's knuckles whitened around his glass. I reached into the briefcase, pulled out the first stack of papers, and laid them gently on the polished wood. The silence was absolute. The air inside the dining room thickened, until it felt like I was pushing against it with every breath. Forks and knives hovered in mid-air, conversations halted mid-sentence. All eyes were on me. I placed the first packet on the polished sideboard. The shuffle of paper against wood sounded louder than the music still faintly playing in the background. "These," I said, my voice steady, "are the mortgage payments. Every month for years. Money that left my account so this house could remain yours." I slid the stack toward the nearest guest, a man in a tailored suit with silver hair. He hesitated, then reached out, flipping through the papers. His brows furrowed, his lips parted in disbelief. He passed the packet to the woman beside him. I pulled out the second packet. "These are the tuition payments. College. Graduate school. Every loan signed by me. Every interest rate I shouldered while I drove an old truck and patched my own roof with tar." A murmur rose at the table. Eyes darted toward David, whose face had drained of color. He opened his mouth, but I raised my hand, silencing him before a word could escape. "You told your colleagues, your friends, your in-laws," I continued, "that you built this life on your own. That you climbed from nothing. But the truth is," I held up my scarred hands, "the calluses rough under the light, these built it." And I was erased from the story. The room was silent, except for the faint clinking of a guest setting down their wineglass too hard. Jenna's mother's face tightened. "This is highly inappropriate." "No," I cut in, calm but sharp. "What's inappropriate is a son telling his father he doesn't belong at the table he paid for. What's inappropriate is a wife who thinks erasing me makes her family shine brighter. Tonight, the lights are on. Let's see what the truth looks like under them." I pulled another packet, laid it flat. Hospital bills. Times when David lost his job and I covered his family's health insurance. Grocery money. Utilities. Vacations they couldn't afford but took anyway. All of it funded by me. Gasps spread like wildfire. One woman at the far end of the table whispered, "My God," I could see the shifts happening, guests leaning back, their admiration turning to suspicion, eyes narrowing at Jenna's family. David finally found his voice. Dad, stop. You're humiliating us. I turned, locking eyes with him. No, son. You did that yourself when you decided appearances mattered more than truth. When you left me sitting alone on Christmas. His jaw worked, but no words came. I opened the last section of the briefcase. 12 neatly collated packets, each bound with a clip. I picked them up and began placing them around the table in front of each guest. Pages filled with numbers, signatures, proof. One by one, guests picked them up, flipping, scanning. The rustle of paper became a soundtrack of unraveling lies. Henry stood, then steady calm, his presence like a gavel. I've seen these documents, he told the room. His voice carried weight, echoing with authority. I can confirm every page is real. This man has carried his son for years. And this family, he gestured toward Jenna and her parents, has hidden that truth while parading themselves as self-made. A ripple of shock coursed through the guests. Someone at the far end muttered, shameful. Jenna slammed her glass down. This is slander. He's twisting the story, I cut in before she could gather steam. Twisting, then explained the bank transfers, the receipts, the credit card statements with your name on every purchase. Designer handbags, vacations, renovations. My money while you looked me in the eye and told me I wasn't welcome in the home I paid for. Her face reddened, but she stayed silent. The silence said more than denial ever could. Jenna's father cleared his throat, his voice brittle. You've made your point. Now leave. I shook my head slowly. Not until everyone here understands. You told people I was bitter, that I was unstable, that I didn't belong. But tonight you don't get to hide behind whispers. You get to look at the man who built this life, and you get to answer why he was left out in the cold. The silence stretched. Guests shifted uncomfortably. One older woman turned to David, her voice sharp. You let your father sit alone on Christmas after all this. David's lips moved, searching for words, but none came. His shame was laid bare in the flush of his cheeks, the tremble in his hand as he set down his wine. I straightened, buttoning my jacket. I don't need your applause. I don't need your pity. I only needed one thing, that you couldn't look away anymore. That you'd see me for who I am, not a ghost, not an embarrassment, but the man who gave everything. I picked up the empty briefcase, snapped it shut, and turned toward the door. The room stayed silent, save for the sound of papers, turning guests, still reading, still absorbing. Behind me, I heard Henry's voice one last time. Justice has a way of arriving right on time. And then I stepped out into the cold night, my breath clouding before me, my chest lighter than it had been in years. The night air hit me like a wave of ice when I stepped outside, but for the first time in years I didn't shiver. My chest felt strangely light, my steps steady as I walked down the long driveway toward my truck. Behind me, through the tall windows, the room remained lit. Guests hunched over papers, voices rising and falling, like a storm contained within glass walls. I could almost hear the murmurs. How could they all these years? Unbelievable. My truck door groaned as I pulled it open, but before I climbed in, I turned back for one last look. The house that once felt untouchable now looked different, smaller somehow. Fragile. Inside, chaos was spreading. I could see David on his feet, gesturing wildly, his words lost to me, but clear enough in their desperation. Jenna's mother stood rigid, her posture stiff as stone, while guests leaned away from her, their faces carved with judgment. A man in a gray suit shook his head, setting down the packet as though it burned his hands. The hum of their unraveling reached me even across the cold night. Henry stepped outside a few minutes later. His coat was pulled tight around him, his breath white in the darkness. He walked toward me, his pace unhurried. You did it, he said softly, standing beside me. You gave them the truth where they could not look away. I leaned against the truck, the leather briefcase still under my arm, and his eyes flicked toward the house. They're in pieces. Guests are leaving early. Some wouldn't even shake David's hand. Jenna's father tried to claim it was all fabricated, but once the papers started making rounds, no one believed him. A small, grim smile tugged at my lips. Good. Henry's gaze was steady. You didn't just humiliate them, Max. You broke the mask they'd worn for years. And once a mask cracks, it can't be mended. We stood in silence for a long moment, the night filled with the faint sound of tires on snow as cars began pulling away from the house. The headlights cut through the dark one after another like a procession of judgment. Finally, Henry rested a hand on my shoulder. Go home. Rest. Tonight was the beginning, not the end. I nodded, climbing into my truck. The engine roared to life, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like a man weighed down by shame. I felt like a man who had finally set something free. Back at my house, the quiet greeted me like an old friend. The tree light still glowed faintly in the corner, though the ornaments seemed duller now. I hung my jacket, set the briefcase down on the table, and poured myself a glass of water. My hands were steady. I sank into the chair by the window, staring out into the night. Across town, my son was probably shouting Jenna, crying her parents, scrambling to salvage their reputation. But here in my little house, there was peace. For years, I had thought peace meant reconciliation. Tonight, I realized peace sometimes meant release. I raised the glass toward the photograph of Linda on the mantel. We're free now, I whispered. Both of us. And for the first time since Christmas, I slept through the night without waking in a cold sweat. The fallout didn't stop at Jenna's parents' table. Word spread faster than wildfire through a dry forest. By the second day of the new year, Spokane felt like a town built entirely of whispers, every corner holding a fragment of my story. I noticed it first at the diner I'd gone to every Sunday morning for years. The waitress Nancy, usually breezy and quick with refills, set my coffee down and lingered a second longer. Heard you had quite a New Year's, Max, she said quietly, a knowing look in her eyes. I blinked, caught off guard. Word travels fast, I muttered. You did the right thing, she said, tapping the table gently before walking away. Later at the hardware store, a neighbor I hadn't spoken to in months caught my arm by the paint aisle. Is it true, he asked, voice lowered, that you paid for their house, that everything they brag about came from you? I didn't answer directly. Just gave a small, tired nod. His mouth pressed into a thin line, then he shook his head. Shameful. They'd been strutting around here like royalty. People needed to know. By the time I left, 3 more people had approached me. Some offered quiet encouragement. Some only shook their heads in disbelief. It was as if the entire town had been waiting for this mask to slip. Meanwhile, the cracks in David and Jenna's world were spreading. Henry called me 2 nights later. His voice carried both gravity and quiet satisfaction. I was at a council meeting today. Half the room was buzzing about the Jenkins family and what happened. They're trying to downplay it, but it's not working. Too many people saw. Too many people are talking. I leaned against the kitchen counter, staring at the envelope that now sat emptied on my table. And David, he's in retreat. I hear he hasn't shown up at the office since the dinner. A few clients have already pulled out of deals. Reputation is currency, Max. And theirs is bankrupt. I didn't gloat. Instead, I let the words settle inside me like slow-burning embers. At the grocery store, I saw it firsthand. Jenna stood in line with a cart full of overpriced wine and cheeses. Her perfect posture strained her smile too tight. When she noticed me, her face flickered anger, embarrassment, something like fear. 2 women behind her leaned close to whisper, their eyes darting toward her, then toward me. Jenna's cheeks flushed crimson. For the first time in years, it wasn't me who looked small in public. It was her. That night, Rosa came by with a casserole, her way of keeping me fed and reminding me I wasn't alone. We ate at my kitchen table, the air warm with the smell of melted cheese and garlic. You should know, she said between bites, you become the talk of the town. But not in a bad way. People are admiring you, Max. They're saying you finally stood up. That you gave a voice to every parent who's been used and discarded. I set my fork down, shaking my head slightly. I wasn't trying to be a symbol. You didn't need to, she replied. Sometimes, truth spreads wider than the person who speaks it. Her words landed heavy but comforting. I realized she was right. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about every father, every mother who had sacrificed quietly and been erased. The humiliation was public now, and it wasn't mine to carry. When Rosa left that evening, I stood on the porch watching the frost settle across the neighborhood roofs. For years, this street had felt like a place I passed through unseen. Now neighbors waved as they walked dogs or pulled trash bins to the curb. Some nodded with respect. Some even smiled. I wasn't invisible anymore. And somewhere across town in their grand house with its glittering chandeliers, David and Jenna were learning what it felt like to be on the other side of whispers. It was late afternoon when the knock came sharp, uneven, almost frantic. I knew before I opened the door who it was. David stood on the porch, his hair disheveled, his suit wrinkled as though he'd slept in it. His eyes were rimmed red, his jaw tight. For a moment I thought he looked like the boy I'd raised, the boy who once ran into my arms after a scraped knee. But then the bitterness in his expression reminded me this was a man who had forgotten his roots. "Dad," he said, his voice strained. "We need to talk." I stepped aside without a word. He entered, pacing the living room like a trapped animal. His hands flexed fists, opening and closing. "What you did," he began, his tone low, shaking with restrained fury, "was unforgivable. You humiliated me. You humiliated my wife, my in-laws. Everyone was there." I leaned against the arm of the chair, crossing my arms. "I didn't humiliate you, David." I revealed the truth. "You humiliated yourself the moment you pretended I didn't exist." He stopped pacing, turned toward me, his eyes blazing. "You think that was the time or the place, a family dinner, New Year's Eve, you ruined everything?" A bitter laugh escaped me. "Everything, David? What exactly did I ruin? Your lives, the fayade you've built with other people's money?" His jaw clenched so hard I thought his teeth might crack. He pointed a trembling finger at me. "You don't understand. Reputation matters. Connections matter. Do you know how many calls I've had since that night? How many clients backed out because of the spectacle you made?" I straightened slowly, my voice low and deliberate. "Do you know how many Christmases I sat alone because you decided appearances mattered more than family? Do you know how many times I told myself you'd come around only to be left with silence for a flicker of a second?" His anger wavered. His mouth opened, then closed, words failing him. He ran a hand down his face, exhaling sharply. "You've destroyed me," he whispered, softer now, almost broken. "Do you get that you've destroyed everything I worked for?" I stepped closer, locking eyes with him. "No, David. I destroyed the mask, the illusion. What you built was on my back, my money, my sacrifices. And when you erased me, you erased the very foundation. It was bound to collapse. I just pushed it along." His shoulders sagged, his bravado leaking away. He sat heavily on the couch, burying his face in his hands. For the first time in years, I saw something real in him, not arrogance, not entitlement, but despair. "I don't know what to do," he muttered into his palms. "You learn," I said quietly. "You learn what it means to live without leaning on someone you've discarded. You learn humility. And maybe if you're lucky, you learn to be the kind of father your child deserves." The room fell silent, except for the ticking clock on the wall. David lifted his head, his eyes glassy. He looked at me, really looked as if seeing the man behind the calloused hands and tired eyes for the first time in years. "You hate me," he whispered. I shook my head slowly. "I don't hate you. I pity you. Because one day your son will look at you the way you've looked at me, and you'll know exactly how it feels to be forgotten." The words hit harder than I expected, hanging in the air between us like a verdict. David stood abruptly, brushing invisible dust from his pants, his face hardening again, though the cracks in his mask remained. "This isn't over," he said, his voice hoarse. "You'll regret what you did." I met his gaze evenly. "I already did, David. For years. But not anymore." He turned, stormed out the door, and the slam echoed through the house like thunder. For a long time, I stood in the quiet, my chest heavy but unburdened. The confrontation hadn't ended anything, but it had revealed something vital for the first time. David wasn't untouchable. And he knew it. It didn't take long for Jenna's family to feel the sting of public judgment. Spokane was not a large city, and word moved quickly through the corridors of business clubs, churches, and charity circles. The New Year's Eve dinner that was supposed to cement their prestige had become a cautionary tale whispered everywhere. Henry told me first. He came by one morning with his usual steady stride, a newspaper tucked under his arm. Without a word, he set it on my kitchen table and slid it toward me. On page 3, a small column reported that a prominent Spokane family was facing financial strain and embarrassing revelations about how their wealth had been sustained. It didn't name names, but everyone knew. The grapevine had already done the work. They tried to spin it, Henry said, sipping from the mug of coffee I'd poured him. But the more they deny, the worse it looks. People saw those papers with their own eyes. No amount of handshaking is going to make this go away. I traced the headline with my finger, feeling a quiet sense of inevitability. Later that week, I passed by the Spokane Country Club. Through the wide glass windows, I spotted Jenna's father, once a man who commanded the room with his booming laugh and steady handshake, now sitting alone at the bar. A group of men I recognized from the business council walked past him without so much as a nod. One even muttered something under his breath, shaking his head. The fall was swift and merciless. At church that Sunday, whispers filled the pews. Catherine, usually radiant in her pearls, sat stiff as a statue. When the choir finished its hymn, I noticed the woman beside her shift away slightly, the distance subtle but telling. In communities like ours, silence could be sharper than words. The grocery store scene played out again, too. Jenna, once the darling of charity luncheons and social gatherings, found herself on the receiving end of pointed stares. A woman I knew from Rosa's knitting circle walked past her in the produce aisle and greeted me warmly instead, as if making a choice. Jenna's cheeks flushed as red as the apples in her cart. But the clearest sign came when David called me late one night. His voice was ragged, frayed at the edges. "They're shutting me out," he admitted, almost choking on the words. "The Jenkins name doesn't open doors anymore. People won't return my calls. Clients are dropping left and right. Dad, I don't know what to do." I let the silence hang for a beat, then answered evenly. "Now you know what it feels like to stand on shaky ground? To feel unwanted. Maybe you'll think twice before casting others aside so easily." His breath hitched, but he didn't argue. For the first time, he sounded less like a man angry at me and more like one afraid of the world he'd built collapsing. Rosa stopped by the next day with a basket of muffins. She set them on the counter, her eyes glinting with something like satisfaction. "They're getting exactly what they gave you," she said, her voice steady but firm. I nodded slowly. "It's not about revenge anymore, Rosa. It's about balance. They took too much, and now the scales are tipping back." Still, I couldn't deny a part of me felt the sweetness of justice. Not because I'd hurt them, but because their own arrogance had finally come home to roost. That night, I sat by the window with the briefcase beside me, now empty, but still carrying the weight of what it had done. Outside, the neighborhood was quiet, the snow reflecting the glow of the street lamps. For years, I had wondered if the truth would ever matter. Now I saw it did not because it fixed the past, but because it forced the present to be honest. And as Jenna's family's empire cracked under the weight of exposure, I felt something I hadn't in a long time: vindication. The strangest thing about truth is how it ripples. For years, I had been invisible in my own son's story, erased from the photographs, the speeches, the polite conversations where people praised his hard work. Now suddenly people were seeing me again. Not as a ghost, not as an afterthought, but as a man who had carried more than anyone knew. It began at the hardware store. The clerk, a kid barely out of high school, bagged my screws and paint thinner, then hesitated. "Mr. Thompson, right?" he asked. "That's me," I said cautiously. His ears turned red. I just wanted to say what you did at that dinner, standing up for yourself. That was, well, it was something. My dad's been through the same kind of thing with my older brother. People forget the ones who made sacrifices. It was good to see someone not take it anymore. He handed me the bag like he was passing a medal. I walked out of the store heavier than when I'd entered, but it was the kind of weight that felt earned. Later that week, Rosa invited me to her community group, a simple gathering in the church basement, folding chairs, set in a circle. I almost didn't go. but she insisted. When I arrived, conversation stilled for a moment. I felt the old instinct to shrink to avoid the eyes that might judge me. But then, one by one, people nodded, some smiled. An older man in a flannel shirt leaned forward. "You're Max, right? We heard what you did. Took guts." Reminded me of my own father. He never let anyone walk on him either. I chuckled softly, shaking my head. It wasn't about guts. It was about finally running out of silence. But the group understood. They shared their stories. Parents overlooked sacrifices, taken for granted children who only remembered to call when they needed money. It was as if my reckoning had given others permission to speak their own truths. For the first time, I didn't feel alone in my pain. The turning point came when I was asked to attend a local council meeting, not as a businessman, not as anyone's father, but as myself. Henry had mentioned my name, and somehow it stuck. The room was filled with familiar faces, some curious, some cautious. When the floor opened for discussion, a councilwoman turned toward me. "Mr. Thompson, you've been through something many in this community can relate to. Parents, grandparents too often overlook their contributions, erase. Would you be willing to share what you've learned?" For a moment I froze. Speaking in front of this crowd wasn't something I'd prepared for. But then I thought of Linda, of the years I'd worked my hands raw, of the Christmas dinners eaten alone. I stood, my voice steady. "All I can tell you is this: sacrifice without recognition is still sacrifice. Love given even when thrown aside is still love. But there comes a point when silence becomes a prison. And the only way out is to open the door yourself." The room was quiet when I finished. Not the kind of quiet that comes from disinterest, but the kind that comes when words settle into bone. Then slowly people began to clap. Not loud, not theatrical, just steady. Honest. For years I had been erased. Now I was seen. That night, walking home from the meeting, the winter air felt less bitter. Neighbors waved as I passed, some even calling out greetings. At my porch, I paused, looking up at the stars. I thought of David, not with anger, but with a weary kind of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he had heard some of those whispers too. Maybe he would understand that when the world starts to turn its back on you, it's the truth that steadies your feet. For now, it was enough to know that I had stepped back into the light, and that the spotlight wasn't something I sought, but something I had finally earned. Winter was loosening its grip by the time the last piece of fallout landed. I was sitting at my kitchen table one morning, the smell of fresh coffee curling through the air, when Henry knocked on my door. He carried a thin envelope, his expression grim but tinged with satisfaction. "It's official," he said, handing it over. "Foreclosure notice. They've missed too many payments. The house isn't theirs anymore." I opened the envelope, slowly scanning the lines of bureaucratic text. It was cold, clinical, but the weight of it was undeniable. The Jenkins family, Jenna's proud, untouchable clan, had lost their fortress. I didn't smile. Not exactly. But something in me relaxed, a knot untangled after years of tension. Henry watched me closely. "How do you feel?" I leaned back in my chair, staring at the paper. Like the scales finally balanced. News of the foreclosure spread just as quickly as the humiliation at New Year's had. People in Spokane didn't just whisper anymore. They spoke openly. At the diner, I overheard a conversation at the next booth. "Did you hear Jenkins' place is on the market? Guess all those big words and fancy dinners didn't keep the bills paid." "Yeah," the other replied. Funny how the man who bragged the loudest had to be carried on someone else's back. The waitress caught my eye as she poured my coffee. She didn't say anything, but the small, knowing smile said enough. At church, the once proud Catherine now avoided eye contact, her pearls absent, her hat plain. People no longer gathered around her after service. They drifted toward me instead, some shaking my hand, others clapping my shoulder as if I'd won a fight. They'd all been too timid to start. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about justice. And justice, when it came, was quiet, undeniable, and permanent. David came by a week later. He looked different, tired, thinner, the sharp edges of arrogance dulled by defeat. He stood on my porch, shifting his weight like a boy again, though he was a grown man with his own child now. "Dad," he said, his voice low, "we lost the house." I nodded. "I know." He swallowed hard. We've been staying at a hotel. Jenna's parents, well, they're not exactly in a position to help anymore. Everything's gone. His words trailed off heavy with shame. For a moment I almost softened. Almost. But then I remembered Christmas, the empty chair, the silence of the phone that never rang, the years of sacrifice erased by a wave of Jenna's hand. I warned you, I said simply. A life built on someone else's sacrifice is a house built on sand. Eventually, the tide comes in. He looked at me, eyes wet. Can we start over, please? I don't care about the money anymore. I don't want to lose you too. The plea hit somewhere deep, but I held my ground. Starting over isn't something you ask for. It's something you prove every day. Respect isn't words, David, it's choices. He nodded, defeated, and for once he didn't argue. He just stood there, a broken man where a proud one had once stood. Then he walked away. That night I lit a fire in the hearth. I pulled out the last of the papers, the copies I'd kept for myself. One by one I fed them to the flames. Mortgage transfers, receipts, old ledgers. The fire consumed them hungrily, sparks leaping up the chimney. I raised my glass of whiskey toward the mantel where Linda's photograph still sat. It's done, I whispered. The house was quiet, but it didn't feel lonely anymore. Outside, snow still clung to the rooftops, but beneath it, I knew spring was coming. And then the doorbell rang. When I opened it, Rosa stood there holding a casserole dish, her smile warm. Behind her were her grandkids chattering, their cheeks pink from the cold. We thought you might like some company, she said softly. I stepped aside, letting them in. The house filled quickly with voices, with laughter, with life. As I sat down at the table watching the kids chase each other around the room, I realized something profound. Revenge hadn't been about their ruin. It had been about reclaiming my place in the world. And I had it now. Not in David's house. Not in Jenna's circle. But here in my own home, surrounded by people who wanted me not for my money or my silence, but for myself. Sweet revenge was never just about humiliation. It was about freedom. And as the laughter rose around me, I knew I'd finally found it. By March, Spokane was beginning to thaw. The icicles that had clung stubbornly to rooftops melted into rivulets along the sidewalks, and the heavy gray skies gave way to thin slivers of blue. It was as if the whole town had exhaled after a long, bitter season. I sat on my porch with a mug of coffee, the steam curling upward in the cool air. Rosa's grandkids played in the yard, their laughter carrying like bells down the street. A few neighbors waved as they passed, and I found myself smiling back, something I hadn't done with ease in years. Life felt lighter, not because the past had disappeared, but because I no longer carried it like a burden chained to my chest. Word of the Jenkins family's downfall had reached far beyond Spokane. Their house had been sold at auction. Jenna's parents retreated quietly, their social invitations drying up faster than spilled water on hot pavement. David and Jenna had moved into a modest rental on the edge of town, far away from the glittering chandeliers and charity galas they once flaunted. I hadn't seen them since the day David came to my porch, his pride crumbling in his hands. But I heard whispers. Jenna struggled to adjust to a life without prestige. David was working odd jobs, humbled in ways I don't think he had ever imagined. There was no pleasure in their suffering. But there was peace in knowing that the world had revealed what I already knew: arrogance built on someone else's sacrifice cannot last. Henry visited one afternoon carrying a folder under his arm. "You've become something of a symbol, Max," he said with a half smile. "The council wants you to speak at the community center. Share your story." I shook my head, chuckling softly. I never asked for a spotlight. "You didn't have to," he replied. "Truth has a way of shining on its own." I agreed reluctantly. A week later, I stood in front of a crowd, parents, grandparents, young couples, telling them what I'd learned. I spoke about sacrifice, about silence, about finding your voice even when it trembles. When I finished, the applause wasn't loud, but it was steady. Genuine. Afterward, a young mother came up to me, her toddler clinging to her leg. "Thank you," she said. "I've been taking care of my parents, and sometimes it feels like no one sees me. Hearing you, it mattered. That was when I realized my story wasn't just mine anymore. It was a mirror reflecting the struggles of countless families. On Easter Sunday, Rosa invited me to join her family for dinner. I hesitated at first. It had been years since I sat at a holiday table without the ache of exclusion, but something in her smile convinced me. The table was long cluttered with ham mashed potatoes, deviled eggs, and pies. Rosa's grandchildren sat beside me, eager to show me their school drawings. Laughter echoed off the walls, and for the first time in a long time I didn't feel like a guest. I felt like family. As dessert plates were cleared, Rosa leaned toward me. "You've come a long way, Max," she said gently. I nodded, looking at the children, then at her. I guess I finally learned that family isn't just blood. It's who shows up, who wants you there. Her hand brushed mine briefly, a quiet affirmation. Later that night, back in my own home, I stood before the mantel. Linda's photograph still sat there, her smile eternal. Beside it now was a new picture me with Rosa and her grandchildren taken that afternoon. I lifted my glass of whiskey, the firelight flickering against the frames. "We're okay now," I whispered to her. The house felt alive again, filled not with echoes of absence, but with the promise of presence. I knew there would still be hard days, but I also knew I wasn't invisible anymore. My sacrifices had finally been seen, my voice finally heard. And in the quiet glow of that spring evening, I understood something simple yet profound. Revenge hadn't been about destroying them. It had been about reclaiming me. And I had. Spring had fully arrived by the time the letter came. It was tucked between the grocery flyers and utility bills, its envelope plain, the handwriting unfamiliar. When I opened it, the words inside stopped me cold. "Dear Grandpa, Mom doesn't know I wrote this, but I wanted to. I'm sorry I haven't seen you. Dad told me some things, and I think I understand more now. I hope someday we can sit together. I want to hear your stories." It was signed simply Ethan, my grandson. For a long moment, I just sat in the kitchen, the letter trembling in my hands. My chest felt tight, but not in the heavy way it once had. This was different. This was hope. Maybe I wouldn't be at every birthday. Maybe I'd miss the early years. But someday, somewhere, there would be a bridge between us. And that was enough. That night, as I sat on the porch, watching the sun sink into the horizon, I realized something important. Revenge hadn't been the end of my story. It had only been the turning point. The humiliation of Jenna's family, the collapse of their empire, the reckoning with David, those were necessary truths. But the real victory wasn't their downfall. It was this: I was no longer invisible. I was no longer silent. And the world, even if just a small corner of it, now knew my story. So here I am, closing this chapter, not just for myself, but for you, the ones who listened. Maybe you've been overlooked. Maybe you've sacrificed in ways no one thanked you for. Maybe you've sat at empty tables, or stared at unopened doors, or heard silence where love should have been. If you have, then know this: you are not alone. My journey was about reclaiming dignity, about learning that even when family turns away, you can still find light. In friends and neighbors and communities, and sometimes even in new beginnings you never expected. And to my grandson, if these words ever reach, you know that my door will always be open. Before I end, let me turn to you, the ones who've stayed with me through every page, every moment. Thank you. Thank you for listening to a story about an ordinary man who fought for his place in the world. Thank you for giving your time, your attention, and maybe even a piece of your heart. As you finish this tale, I don't just want you to remember the revenge or the downfall. I want you to remember the lesson: a family is not who shares your name, but who shares your heart. Cherish the people who show up for you. Forgive when you can. Walk away when you must. And never, ever believe that your sacrifices made in love are wasted. They shape the world, even if it takes years for anyone to see. So I'll raise my glass one last time, not just to Linda's picture on the mantel, not just to Rosa and her family, but to you wherever you are. May you find strength in your struggles. May you find love in unexpected places. And may your own table at every holiday and every ordinary day Always be full of warmth, laughter, and people who truly want you there. Good night and God bless. And if you haven't yet, don't forget to subscribe because there are always more stories to tell, more truths to uncover, and more hearts to reach. Until the next one, I wish you health, peace, and happiness for you and your family.